The first story that I want to cover today is the Silicon and Signature Banks crash and subsequent bailout, which the Biden administration is avoiding calling a bailout because they don't want any reference to the 2008 crisis. They don't want people to think we're seeing a repeat of the 2008 crisis, but we may very well maybe. So there are a couple of great articles published about the crash of those banks that we'll cover here. So the first article I want to bring up is from People's Dispatch. This is an article or an interview that they called "A Government for and of the Banks in the U.S." It's an interview with this guy here. I'm not sure if he's an economist or what, but he's basically going to lay out the basics of what happened. And I'll just start with that and then comment on it when I'm ready.
Crisis in the United States, the crash.
Sorry, I was muted.
U.S. government at the end of the day, when it comes to working class people going broke, is always saying, well, we don't really have the money. But when it comes to banks taking insane, risky bets and completely collapsing, they say, don't worry, you're too big to fail and we got you covered.
There's another banking crisis in the United States. The crash of the Silicon Valley Bank has set alarm bells ringing, people and experts wondering what this means for the banking sector at large, even for the economy of the United States at large. Now, this is a complex subject. There's a lot of debates around interest rates. There's a question of how such a big bank crashed, the fact that the government was quick to come with a bailout for Silicon Valley Bank, as well as offer similar facilities for other banks. To explain all this, we have with us Eugene Perito of Breakthrough News. Eugene, thank you so much for joining us. So news of yet another banking crisis. I mean, we're hearing a lot of terms about interest rates, about collapses, bailouts, etc., etc. But for the benefit of viewers, could you first maybe just give us a definition of, or a description rather, of what exactly is the crisis? Who are the players and what has brought us to this current situation?
Well, the current banking crisis, or at least potential banking crisis in the United States, is really centered primarily around one bank, Silicon Valley Bank, which is one of the major banks that facilitates the growth of the technology and biotechnology, biopharmaceutical industries, and other similar banks like Signature Bank in New York that sort of serve a similar purpose. By and large, these are the banks that are used by the biggest investors when they are looking to facilitate the growth of the companies they're investing in those sectors. They say, go.
So when Lenin is talking about the dominance of finance capital and the increase in concentration of the banks and industry and the merger of banking and industry that takes place really at the transition from the 19th to the 20th century, he's talking about the merger of industrial capital, usually in Lenin's day, like productive capital, things like steel, industries like mining, industries like rail. These were merging together with the big banks, and they were forming giant monopolies that essentially were invested in every industry or controlled part of every industry via stocks, via shares. Now we've seen the merger of the tech sector and the pharmaceutical industry with banking, with finance capital. So it's a similar development to what Lenin was noticing, and it's one that's come about over, the last 40 years of neoliberalism, but really the last 20 years when we're talking about tech and how the pharmaceutical industry is, shot up in their wealth, power, and control over the past 10 or 20 years. So Silicon Valley Bank is a perfect example of that. It finances all these giant tech companies that have monopolized more and more of the tech sector and have become a bigger player in the global and domestic economy, to the point where these Biden regulators said that if they didn't bail out Signature and Silicon Valley Bank, it would have led to a total collapse of the financial system, similar to 2008, even though they don't want to call it a bailout because, it'll be reminiscent of 2008. So this is the kind of crises that you would expect. If this is an incoming recession, this is the kind of crisis that you would expect in the neoliberal era, where we've had this giant merger of tech, pharmaceutical, and finance capital, and the monopolization of many industries by those capitalists, folks like Mark Zuckerberg. And COVID led to a boom of these industries, not only the pharmaceutical industry during COVID, who, made tons of money selling the vaccine and enforcing a vaccine apartheid on the global south, but also the tech sector. because more people were in their homes, less people were going outside. So there was a boom in tech, just because people were on their computers and on their phones. So COVID allowed a larger concentration of capital in these industries than there even was before. And this leads to an increased control over the state, an increased control over the government, which is a dictatorship of capital. The state is a tool that has a monopoly on violence. They're the only ones allowed to use violence without being punished. And they use it as a tool of class suppression to suppress the working masses on behalf of the ruling class. They mediate the class relations between the two, the irreconcilable contradiction between the workers and the owners. So with this concentration of capital in the pharmaceutical industry, in the tech sector, and their merger with banking, those industries and the capitalists at the head of those industries have increasingly come to control the state, increasingly come to control the government, the financial oligarchy. So during COVID, we saw obviously a lot of controversy surrounding the mandates. There were cover-ups of information related to the lab leak theory. Read Jeffrey Sachs and the Lancet's final COVID report, if you don't believe me there. There was a lot of censorship. Obviously, we started getting our accounts banned. We had the vaccine apartheid that was enforced on the global south, like I said. And while all these things were going on, all these acts of state repression, Big Pharma was running out the back door with all the money. And for an in-depth analysis of that from me, you can read the Journal of American Socialist Studies 2, which is now available on Midwestern Marks on paperback and ebook, where I do a deep dive into the American healthcare system and the development of it since or during COVID. But yeah, these Silicon Valley executives, the executives at the Silicon Valley Bank that just got bailed out also donated thousands of dollars to the Biden administration, to the Biden campaign when he was running against Trump. And now the DNC and the administration has given all that money to charity, right, to try and save face because people noticed the blatant corruption of Biden and the government bailing out a bank that donated to their campaign. So they donated this money back to charity, but this shows you exactly how the financial oligarchy works, right? The Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank fund the operations of different tech companies, Facebook or Meta or whatever else. And then they lobby the government. They donate money to certain campaigns so that they can control the government. And then when they go under, when there's a crisis, which is they're inherent to capitalism, they're always going to happen. The government can come bail out these banks while everyone else suffers, while everyone else has their jobs laid off, or everyone else gets laid off, or however else. The ruling class tries to respond to these crises. But yeah, not a good sign that this bank is going under. Not a good sign at all. Points towards a recession. There were some people talking about how we already went through a recession under Trump and now we're on the recovery thanks to Biden. That's just partisan hackery. That's just political hackery. That's not how the economy works. I think COVID was not a great economic time for the masses. It was a huge, the tech and pharmaceutical companies were making giant sums of revenue, like we said, but it was a little bit of an economic downturn or a slowdown, but I don't think it was the crash. I don't think it was the crisis or the recession that's incoming. So lab leak is BS. Vaccine apartheid also sounds like BS. Do I need to pull out my healthcare administration essays for you? The vaccine apartheid is even acknowledged by mainstream sources, which read the Journal of American Socialist Studies. My article in that discusses all of this. But here's a peer-reviewed academic article from the National Library of Medicine and the National Center for Biotechnological Information. Vaccine apartheid, the separation of the world's poorest and most vulnerable. And this was enforced by the pharmaceutical companies via the World Trade Organization and via these global state apparatuses. Like we were saying, the state, the government, is a tool of capital. So the pharmaceutical capitalists control the World Trade Organization and these other organizations that used intellectual property laws to prevent countries in the global south not just from importing the vaccine, but even making the vaccine, which is why Cuba had to create its own recipe. They had to create their own vaccine different from this vaccine because intellectual property laws were being used to stop the mass manufacturing of something that would have stopped or helped stop the spread of COVID. And then if you want to hear about the Lab League, it's definitely not BS. Go to the Lancet COVID final report by Jeffrey Sachs, where he had to kick certain people out of the COVID commission that was hired by the Lancet to investigate this, that Jeffrey Sachs was the chair of, because there were people within the Lancet who were trying to cover up any evidence that there could have been a lab leak. And it's not that we know there's a lab leak, right? It's not that it's 100% certain, but what we know for sure is that the lab leak hasn't been investigated. There's evidence that points to a lab leak, and not only has it not been investigated, but there have been people within these organizations, the NIH, or branches of the NIH that would investigate this. There have been people like Anthony Fauci within those organizations preventing an investigation from being carried out, right? And this is all peer-reviewed, like well-researched academic scholarly stuff. This isn't me pulling this from Breitbart or OAN or some far-right news outlet. This is just me not just gobbling up everything MSNBC or CNN tells me about COVID. You know, I'm getting my master's in healthcare administration right now. I got to look into these things a little bit deeper than that. I was taking an epidemiology class during the height of COVID. Do you think China is involved in the cover up? I mean, there's certain parts of China would have to be in, like the Wuhan lab, the Wuhan virology lab, that would have to be involved. And then there's certain Chinese media outlets, state media outlets, that have called the lab leak a conspiracy a bunch of times. So it could implicate China and could lead to a criticism of China. Yeah. I know a Marxist criticizing China or saying that China might have done something wrong. What? No. I thought tankies thought existing socialist countries were literally heaven and nothing bad ever happened. Did I already show the video or the article about the banks donating to Biden, Silicon Valley banks? So in relation to that last article about the banks, Mark Zuckerberg was in the news a whole bunch recently for making a bunch of layoffs at Meta, at his new company. So not only did they cut 21,000 total jobs, but they were planning to expand by 5,000 and create 5,000 new jobs, but they got rid of those plans in favor of flattening the organization. So a change in the division of labor at Meta, basically just laying off employees so that they have to pay or don't have to pay so much in wages, and they can keep their absurd profits really high. So since 2022, the tech sector has seen 290,000 workers lose their jobs. So huge layoffs in the tech sector, where we just saw these two giant banks collapse. Those banks, like we said, are inextricably merged with these tech companies. They're the source of financing for these tech companies. And, they oftentimes, banking executives and people on the board of these banks own a lot of shares in the tech companies. So they're, directly merged like that. So increased interest rates from the Fed have been designed to combat inflation, because that's the only way that capitalists have to combat inflation, is to tighten the money supply. So the increased interest rates have hurt big pharma and big tech, who, like we said, are merged with these big banks, because that's where they get their financing from. The capitalists in tech and pharma have to purchase with money productive commodities. The commodities are the goods that are needed to produce whatever goods and services they sell. And then those productive commodities, along with the labor of their workers, creates their product. And their product is sold for more money than what it costs to produce it. And that's how they make their surplus and how they pay to keep their operations going steadily. But a lot of those productive commodities, a lot of their labor and tools and means of production are financed by Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank. Like I said, these companies and these banks are inextricably merged. So if the Fed jacks up interest rates, that's going to make the financing from these banks more expensive for these companies. Now these companies are making millions and millions and millions of dollars in corporate revenue and paying out millions of dollars in shareholder dividends every year. But are they going to cut that? Absolutely not. They're going to cut their workforce, which is what we're seeing now. So as the interest rates go up, these banks start to collapse and the workforces start to be cut, which is how capitalist crises work. And there's ways that the capitalists, the ruling class, has of slowing them down, of trying to prevent them from happening all at once, like the bailing out of Silicon Valley and Signature Bank. Or the Fed increasing interest rates, but they lead to effects elsewhere in the economy, negative effects elsewhere. And it's essentially just pushing the crisis back, just putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound that's bound to burst open. So if for those who have read Capital, you can think about this as the circuit of capital that Marx talks so much about in Volume 2. The capitalists need to put forward money for labor and productive commodities, which produce commodities, which the capitalist then sells for more money. But the money that he uses to purchase his productive commodities is largely coming from the banks in modern capitalism. So if interest rates on the loans, the financing that he gets from the banks go up, it's going to decrease his ability to purchase the productive commodities he needs to create his products, which he uses to make his profit. So the total amount of money that they're producing is going to go down. Yeah, Marxist economics is cool. It helps us understand all this stuff. How cool. So like I said, none of these companies are hurting for revenue. Their revenue rates are actually still growing while this is happening and while these layoffs are going on. And the only solution that government regulators and the Fed and the chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, have offered is, further hiking interest rates to tighten the money supply. The capitalists have no solution to the crises at the core of their system besides, hike interest rates and bail out the giant banks, bail out the giant corporations, and let all the working people suffer. So essentially what increasing the interest rates does for the Fed is increase the reserve army of labor, increase this reserve army of unemployed people looking for work that Marx talks about as a necessary element of capitalism. Pushing people out of their jobs by raising interest rates and decreasing the financing that big corporations can get from these banks is going to push people into unemployment and increase and maintain the size of that reserve army of labor. So shout out to People's Dispatch for writing this article from a class perspective, really from a Marxist perspective, because a lot of the perspectives that you get on these developments in the tech sector are not as good, not as thorough, not as based in class analysis. So this goes over just what happened at Meta. So with Meta's recent layoffs, there was one layoff where last November where they laid off 11,000 workers. And then recently they laid off 10,000, and workers had a town hall meeting with Zuckerberg where they essentially berated him and interrogated him about the recent layoffs. So, this could be a sign of recession. Like I said, it also could be a sign that people don't like Meta. My only experience with Meta is the Meta Business Suite, which is supposed to help you upload videos to Facebook and Instagram in an efficient way. And it just sucks. It literally doesn't even work. So can't stand the Meta Business Suite. Not a huge fan of Meta, but I think more so than demand for Meta products going down, this, is a sign of the increasing inflation, increasing interest rates, and incoming economic crisis. which are built into the core of our system. So it's not essentially, or not just old Zuckerberg's fault. Either way, one of the employees at this town hall asked him, "How can we trust you given recent events?" And Zuckerberg responded, "I would guess that the way you will evaluate whether you trust me and whether you want to work at this company is whether we're succeeding and making progress towards the overall state of goals. Also, I think it comes down to results." So, first of all, Zuckerberg is a robot, the way he responds to people. But second of all, you see the conflicting interests between him and his employees, right? His employees just don't want to get laid off. His employees want their wages insured. They want to know that they won't starve, right? They want to know that they're going to be able to put food on the table and pay rent every month. Whereas Zuckerberg is worried about meeting organizational goals. He's saying you should evaluate whether you want to work here based on, whether we're hitting our organizational goals. Well, what are your organizational goals? Your organizational goals clearly are to maintain revenue and maintain these massive shareholder dividends, massive profits, even if that means cutting your labor force, right? So that shows that you prioritize profits over everything. Otherwise, you would have cut corporate revenues and kept these workers on board. So you achieving your strategic goals for the company and keeping revenue high doesn't necessarily protect the livelihoods of the workers, right? And the workers don't care about strategic goals. Like I said, they just want to be able to put food on the table. They just want benefits and, probably less hours working at this place. But Zuckerberg says you should work here, because we're achieving our company goals. We're achieving our corporate goals. Basically associating or portraying his own interests, his shareholders' interests with the interests of all of society, with the interests of his workers, when in fact those interests are not the same. Whoa, we have a lot of followers now. Hello, 132 people. Do we just get rated? Welcome to everyone new. Thank you, thank you. Make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Whoa, 239. What's going on? Holy crap. Welcome to everyone new. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe. Midwestern Marks. Woohoo. So now I'm kind of distracted. Where was I? So one of the most interesting articles that I saw published in response to this, the layoffs in Silicon Valley and the layoffs in Meta, was this article, Zuckerberg and the Tech Party. And what he means by tech party is what this author calls the year of Zen, the year of corporate Zen. So these tech companies like Google and Facebook or Meta and whatever else have been like trying to portray themselves as really cool, hip companies. Like, we have a ping pong table in the office. We have a putting green in the office. Here at Google, we have Sushi Fridays where we serve you sushi. But their workers are still being exploited, right? It's a distraction from the consistent exploitation of labor and the tough working conditions that these workers are in. Someone must have shared your link. Well, now we lost all our new followers, so they must have hated the stream. But it was nice to have you all while you were here. So this author says it's not just the cuts themselves that are striking here. It's the tone, which Zuckerberg announced the new wave of austerity measures. He adopted the vernacular of the boss of an old economy company. He was a cost killer. He was cold. It isn't personal. It's just business. He was a normal boss. He said that we need to make all organizations as lean as possible. He used the word efficiency a dozen times, including 3 times in the first 2 paragraphs. These 2 paragraphs are a catch-all of corporate lingo that says everything and nothing. Improve our financial performance, difficult environment, execute, optimize, work streams, processes, changes, uncertainty, and focus. He sounds like the CEO of a traditional company. His post is a manual, a guide that other tech CEOs will use as well. So basically saying this, friendly disposition of the tech bosses, this friendly disposition of Google and Zuckerberg and Meta towards the public and towards their workers is over, right? They're no longer these hip, zen, progressive companies. They're now going to be cold, hard, efficient cost killers, which is what they were anyways, right? They, bought their workers a few, like Sushi Fridays when profits were shooting through the roof. during the boom cycle that's leading to the upcoming bust cycle. But ultimately, these are corporations who are subject to the will of the market, right? And if they can keep their surplus value at a certain rate by cutting the labor force, by firing workers, that's what they're going to do. They're not going to ever cut into their own revenues first. They're always going to look out for their class interests. And Zuckerberg even told one of the workers, I want to take accountability for these decisions and for how we got here. I know this is tough for everyone, and I'm especially sorry to those impacted. Like, if you want to take responsibility, if you are truly sorry for these people, why don't you cut shareholder dividends? Why don't you cut stock buybacks? Right? Why don't you cut any of the millions of dollars in surplus value? Or why don't you cut corporate lobbying and stop spending millions of dollars lobbying the government, influencing their policies? Right? These are all places where Meta is spending their surplus value that could be used to pay for workers' wages. So is Zuckerberg really sorry? Is his heart really with those people? Or is he a multimillionaire who's going to screw over as many thousands of people as he needs to continue amassing and accumulating wealth? So this article says that tech and Silicon Valley now enter the normal corporate world. In this world, what matters is pleasing the markets, and markets like cost cuts. The employee is secondary. If you make big profits with the least possible costs, the markets applaud. It's like just saying the quiet part out loud about capitalism, just admitting what capitalism is, that there can never be Zen capitalism, that there can never be friendly capitalism, there can never be humanitarian capitalism that takes care of its workers, because the markets are always going to force even the nicest capitalists to be cold, calculating American psychos. This article also says, interestingly, Zuckerberg's announcements come at the same time as the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, a major player in the startup ecosystem and in Silicon Valley. The two events cannot be separated. Their symbolism is strong. It is the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, or rather, meeting of the old economy and the new one. In case anyone still has doubt, Zuckerberg also appears to be ending the era of remote work at Meta, so not letting people work outside the office anymore. Tech companies previously backed off from forcing employees back into the office. So increasing the intensity of labor, trying to get more value out of his workers by having them in the workplace where they can crack the whip, the management staff can crack the whip on them. Trying to suck more value out of these workers in a time of crisis. And like I said, he calls it the meeting of the old economy and the new economy. It's a transition to, a dominance of tech, finance, and tech capital, finance capital, and pharmaceutical capital is what has come concentrated at the top and come to monopolize the capitalist economy in the modern day. So it is a transition, and, it's not surprising at a time of crisis to see these new rulers of the economy, these tech and pharmaceutical capitalists and bankers, crack down on their workforces. Markets necessitate not just exploitation, but the maximization and the intensification of that exploitation by the bosses. Right? So it's not just that they have to exploit their workers, but they also have to not let their workers work remote, right? Because they might have too much free time that way, and they need to be working, creating value for me. So no more working remote. You got to be in the office. Increasing the intensity of exploitation, which increases the production of surplus value.